So today we're going to look at Apollo versus Dionysian thinking. So we're looking to recognize patterns of thought and motivation and action. So one philosopher that we would like to start with is Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a German philosopher and poet and writer. He became one of the most influential figures of the 19th century. He was born in Prussia. Nietzsche trained at the University of Bonn and then studied at the University of Leipzig, where he became interested in philosophy and literature. He began to develop his ideas about what he called the death of God and will to power and the superhuman. In 1880, he suffered a mental breakdown and was committed to a psychiatric institution where he remained until his death at the age of 55. Despite his very short career and illness, Nietzsche left behind an extensive and highly influential philosophic work. His books are characterized by their poetic and provocative style and by their radical ideas about truth, morality, and Western culture. His defense of the autonomy of the individual and his theory of eternal return are some of the most influential ideas in his work. So Nietzsche writes the book The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music, and it derives opposing ideas in terms of Greek mythology in understanding the way tragedy, music, and dance kind of work out. He also looks deeply into the Appolonian and Dionysian ways of thinking, and he defines these terms as opposing sides of a human personality. He believes the goal of life is to achieve balance between reason and emotion, to be able to think clearly, to be steady, reliable, and responsible for one's actions, and to be able to feel, to enjoy the fruits of the vine, to express both love and hate, unguided by concern for the rules. So in his book, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit, he looks to the great age of drama in the 5th century of Greece. He points out that these performances were carried out by choral music and dance before there was a spoken word. He was troubled by how teachers were defining tragedy with regard to reason rather than looking to the emotion that was conveyed in the story. He then made the distinction between two ways of responding to not one, only theater or drama, but also to how this reflects in real life. So the Apollonian side of human personality, dominated by reason and analysis and rational and coherent thought, seeks meaning, and the Dionysian side of the personality, dominated by feeling, intuition, and freedom from any kind of limit. That side also responds emotionally to music as well as to the force and fury of tragedy. So Apollo represents harmony, progress, clarity, logic, and the principle of individuation, whereas Dionysus represents disorder, intoxication, emotion, ecstasy, and unity, hence the omission of the principle of individuation. Nietzsche used these two forces because for him, the world of the mind and the order on one side and the passion and chaos on the other formed principles that were fundamental to Greek culture. The Apollonian was this dreaming state, kind of full of illusion, and Dionysian, a state of intoxication, representing the kind of liberation from all the things that hold you back and sort of the dissolution of all your boundaries. In this mold, a man appears as the satyr. He is horror of the annihilation of the principle of individuality, and at the same time, someone who delights in its destruction. So he wants to reach out and be part of the whole human experience and be with other humans, but he also is afraid of losing his own individuality. So the Apollonian and Dionysian juxtapositions appear in the interplay of all the different tragedies. The tragic hero of the drama, the main protagonist, the struggle to make order of their unjust and chaotic experience or fate. So, the struggles are Apollonian, and the chaotic fate would be the Dionysian side, where he dies unfulfilled. Elaborating on the conception of Hamlet as an intellectual who cannot make up his mind and is a living antithesis to the man of action. Nietzsche argues that a Dionysian figure possesses the knowledge that his actions cannot change the internal balance of things, and it disgusts him enough to not act at all. Hamlet falls under this category. He glimpses the supernatural reality through the ghost. He has gained true knowledge and knows that no action of his has the power to change it. For the audience of such drama, this tragedy allows them to sense what Nietzsche called the primordial unity, which revives Dionysian nature. He describes primordial unity as the increase of strength and the experience of fullness and the plenitude bestowed by the frenzy. So frenzy acts are like intoxication, and they're crucial for the psychological condition that enables the creation of any art, supposedly. And then they're stimulated by the state of the person's artistic will. So Nietzsche says, in this state, one enriches everything out of one's own fullness. Whatever one sees, whatever one wills, is seen, swelled, taut, strong, overloaded with strength. A man in this state transforms things until they mirror his power, until they are reflections of his perfection. This having to transform into perfection is his art. So here we can see, again, if we look at these sort of how they juxtaposition each other. On the Apollonian side, we see system. On the Dionysian side, we see spontaneity, compulsiveness, impulsiveness. So compulsiveness, like, I have to do it. Impulsiveness is like, oh, okay, I'll try that. So here we have the city, the country, classicism, romanticism, civilization, nature. So these are, kind of ways that these charts help us sort of break it down. So the chart lists contrasts or oppositions between two ways of thinking. Some careful qualifications are in order here. The words in the two columns are not about good or bad. Rather, they represent poles on the ends of a continuum of behavior toward which most people display at one time or another, or display sometimes extreme tendencies, right? So absolute judgments, for instance, that it is better to be compulsive rather than impulsive, should be moderated to excessive impulsiveness or excessive, impulsiveness or excessive compulsiveness. And then you can get into a lot of trouble. And so there's no compensating leavening in the opposite direction. So it's like we really, kind of want to be somewhere in the middle. But when you get to each end, that's where you run into issues. So much of the same thing could be said for reason and emotion, psyche and eros, and all the rest of these different, opposing ideas. So Helene Deutsch provides a rationale to help you get rid of the value judgment when considering these polarities between Apollo and Dionysus. She, like Nietzsche, says of Dionysus, his ability to perform miracles and to personify whatever the situation calls for on the one hand, and his ferocity and amorality on the other, place him outside the moral conception of good and bad. So nevertheless, students see stereotyping of the most negative kind in the male-female continuum of the chart. But Deutsch is helpful here as well. Dionysus appears as a great social revolutionary, the first feminist in the history of mankind, in order to help enslaved women. If anything, she continues disgrace and shame could be attached to Apollo for his matricide, his hatred of Mother Earth, his compulsiveness of order, and not being able to embrace nature, embrace, all that is animalistic about us, right? On the other hand, myth does attribute to Apollo the rescue of the ancient Greek world from the darkness of matriarchy to the light and the rule of the sun. So let's take a look at how we can think about these ideas in the modern day. So here we have an engineer. He sits at his drafting board. Certainly the engineer mostly engages in Appolonian things, like he's reading, he's drawing plans, he's making up blueprints, he's calculating loads and stresses to make sure everything is correct. It's almost compulsive because it's a matter of life and death. He's going to put huge amounts of materials that are going to be above people's heads, for example. So he has to specify all the parts, all the materials, all the processes. But the best engineers probably bring a degree of Dionysian imagination to their tasks, though it might be more to the point to conceive of an Apollonian engineer in service to the more imaginative architect. So, we look at something like Calatrava, the building that the art museum built some years back, and how it looks compared to the original building that was built by Eros Saarinen. There's this kind of make-believe ship with these wings that sort of fly, like when they open up and they kind of look like a dove, or a seagull or something, and the light sort of shines in through it. So it's very imaginative. And then we'd have to sit down and go engineer. How do we engineer all of that? And sometimes it doesn't work, right? So in any case, the engineer who relieves tedium by writing, say, a poem, has definitely moved right along the reason, feeling, and science art scale. So think of this like a continuum, like a scale. So on one hand, you have the reason, the other hand, you have the feeling. One hand you have the science, the other hand you have the art. If after work the engineer escapes the dull confines of the office for the green world of the country, he or she is left, presumably, if only temporarily, the Apollonian abstraction and approached his or her Dionysian feeling. On the other hand, a poet merely communing with nature, not writing about it, begins at the place the engineer has ended. When the poet takes up the quill in hand and commences composition, an ordering of the impression and sensation, he or she has moved left towards Apollonian mind and system. So in other words, it's like the person who wants to play music but sits in their basement and never ends up doing it, right? So they're thinking about it all the time, but they never really take the time to learn the chords on the guitar and how to move each chord, right? They never take the time to learn how to write and put those ideas of fancy and poetry into something. So the poet is writing a poem. The poet's writing of the poem is Apollonian, while the engineer's doing the same thing is decidedly Dionysian. Do you see that? When the poet eventually negotiates for the publication of the poem, he or she has probably moved even further into the Apollonian sphere. No particular value is attached to either condition, right? To any single one of them. But the context, and the dynamic of each and all are significant in profoundly thematic ways. For one thing, one would like to think the engineer is improved both personally and professionally by trying a hand at poetry and by visiting the country and being in nature. But just as the poet who finally gets down to business and writes and publishes the verses is better off for having done so. So just like the person who is very Dionysian and very much in nature and very down to the earth and then suddenly needs to kind of pull it all together at the same time, is trying to balance all of that. So the next thing I want to talk about is the popcorn syndrome. So the popcorn syndrome gives a kind of critical mind evocation to Dionysian excitement without stretching out mental capacity. If a response is largely Dionysian, as when hearing a thrilling interpretation of a musical composition without noticing or thinking about the beauty of the singer's voice, the unexpected shifts in tempo, the alteration between the music crescendos, critical thinking is valid as a process, not as an absolute determination of whether it's good or bad. So empathy and alienation. Empathy in this context, to identify with a character or performer so as to believe in that person, would be Dionysian. Empathy is crucial to the entertainment process. Like, you have to become part of it, right? So alienation, coined by Bertolt Brecht, to be able to sit back and look objectively to what is happening. What vehicles are being used in the story to create the empathy? Why should we care about this character, for example, when he is not such a good person? So, I find myself, I have a master's in film and video, and I find myself watching movies, and I'm looking at the content, and I'm looking at the actors' reactions, and I'm looking at the context of the story, but I'm also looking at the screenshot. I'm looking at the color they use. I'm looking at the lighting. And I'm saying to myself, that really worked, because now I really feel like I'm in it. Now, if I start talking about all that stuff to my husband, he's going to disengage from the movie and be like, wait, what are you talking about? I'm trying to watch the movie. So you can really see here how different people, depending on which end of that spectrum that they're on, can look at empathy and alienation very, very differently. So the importance of an emotional response. So great works of art often solicit an emotional response by their sheer beauty, and they're, quite literally just pull you in. Analysis here is not only irrelevant, but unfair to the artist, right? So the book mentions the first time you might walk into the Sistine Chapel, you become, you're overcome by Michelangelo's work. Is it fair to analyze every single brushstroke at this point, but rather to just be overcome, to let yourself just be human and let it be there, right? So the importance of responding critically. So critical thinking defines and describes and analyzes. So that's moving us back into that Appolonian type of thought. Critical responses build our mental strength. They usually involve the following: defining what we want to determine, what made The Hobbit a good or a bad movie. Putting aside instinctive or emotional responses. Putting aside instinctive or emotional responses. Collecting information and considering all the pertinent facts. Evaluating the work or the topic in its proper context. Not dismissing a story because of customs or attitudes that are foreign to you. So, like, just because a culture might be different than your own, are you completely dismissing it? Being will to understand the characters unlike yourself. So you want to be willing to understand them. Having an informed opinion with evidence to back it up. So you're going to exercise your mind. Critical thinkers are always solving problems. After developing the habit of critical analysis, we are prepared to confront real problems in real life. Challenging assumptions are a fact of everyday communication. Non-critical observers are likely to nod in agreement, void of analysis, mainly because they are unwilling to invest the time needed for the problem solving through careful analysis. So what that means is that we've got a lot of people who will just get pulled up in the, this is what I should believe, and they follow along like sheeps, right? They don't really look ahead. They just look at the person in front of them or the animal in front of them, and they follow along because they are not willing to stop and look around and say, where am I going? Oh, I'm going off a cliff. Oh, I guess that's okay, right? Because everybody else is. Why not? So recognizing context. Everything exists within a context, a framework of circumstance and relationships. This is incredibly important. When you go to one country, say, I do a whole course in color theory, and and we look at what color represents in certain countries is very different. So, for example, like in Africa, people wear white to funerals, not black. In America, we wear white to weddings, right? Different colors mean different things in different cultures. And so if we don't know that, then we're going to only go by our experience and what we know and we're going to have a different opinion of what's really happening. So knowing that nothing exists independently helps critical thinkers to avoid large-scale generalizations and simple evaluations. Let me repeat that. Knowing that nothing exists independently, that there's always a context. You may not know what that context is, and you may not know all the circumstances. But knowing that nothing exists independently helps critical thinkers to avoid large-scale generalizations and simple evaluations, because we know that overgeneralizing and simple evaluations will get us into trouble. The more we are able to recognize the historical context, the less likely we are to evaluate everything in relationship to our own present experience. If we haven't experienced it, if we don't know what those contexts are, we cannot easily evaluate it. When someone is going through life-changing circumstances, cancer, the death of a child, these kinds of contexts that are just devastating. How do we console them had we never really experienced that? How do we sit with them and help them hold their energy? How do we know? We don't. We don't have the context, but we can do the best we can because we care about them. But recognizing that you don't really understand how bad it could be, that's very important. So knowledge of historical context makes one more tolerant of styles not familiar to us. So why, like as a teacher in a classroom, one child acts one way and is, really having a hard time sitting still and, doesn't seem to be able to focus very well and all kinds of other things, where the other child is like, oh, yeah, I understand. Yep, raise your hand. I got the question. I can answer. And they're all there and they're all completely present. So are we going to say that's a good child and a bad child? No, we want to look at what is going on with them, right? As a good teacher, we're going to want to know why, what's happened. Maybe the child who can't sit still has had, parents that fought regularly, or maybe there was a battering situation or abusive situation, and they're constantly on edge because they don't know what's going to happen next. And because of that, they've lost some of their impulse control because there was so much cortisol washing over their brains as children because they were in such depressed and stressful situations that they were never really able to, sit still or relax. And where the other child maybe was brought up in a family where parents were loving, grandparents were available and around, and they got read to regularly. There was always food on the table. There was always, one more, way that parents showed them that they loved them and that they were important, rather than them seem to be an afterthought. So critical viewing. So when we're looking at criticism on a professional level, it can be a career. Negative criticism from professional critics have given them the reputation as snobs. The non-critical viewer may see no reason for such a person's existence. Two categories of professional critics: those who write for popular audiences and are likely to praise a work that has mass appeal, so they kind of go along like the sheep. Those who write for publications like the New Yorker, who appeal to the critical thinking viewer, right? They want to say, like, well, here's one side of the story. Here's also the other side of the story. And this is why there's a problem, or this is why people might think this way or that way. And then there's the critic who serves as a teacher to those of us without substantial background in any particular art form. So the critic who says, this is why this piece of art or this music or this play or this tragedy or whatever it is, this, and remember, like some of the things I was just mentioning earlier, I was talking about life circumstances, because as we saw in the very beginning of the lecture, Nietzsche said that it's not just about the play, it's also about the real life, right? So real life becomes the play. Life is art, art is life, right? So the critic serves as the teacher to those of us without substantial background in any particular art form. They say why the song sounds so great because of the way that the drummer kept time. They say why. And then you go, oh, now I'm going to listen to that again. And I'm going to say, oh, yeah, I hear it. I hear it now. I never heard it before. I kind of glossed over it. All right. So the personal critical response, you do not need to be a professional to engage in the process of evaluation after careful and fair viewing, listening, or reading. This is so important for you to remember. The world is too much with us. The world is too much with us, late and soon. Getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon. That the sea that bears her bosom to the moon, the winds that will be howling as all ours, and are up gathered now like sweeping flowers. For this, for everything, we are out of tune. It moves us not, great God. I'd rather be a pagan suckled in a creed outworn, so might I stand on this pleasant lea, have glimpses that would make me less forlorn, have sight of Proteus rising from the sea, or hear old Triton below his wreath torn. And this is by William Wordsworth. So the first step in becoming an informed personal critic is not to jump to a hasty conclusion. I don't like it, or I love this poem, is an irrelevant remark. The next step is determine, what have you just read, right? So did any of that make sense to you? Do you need to reread it? So what you have just read, describe the poem as clearly and objectively as possible. The poem appears to contain a regretful realization that in a concern for the material welfare, we are no longer living in a close relationship to nature. And we are less and less likely to enjoy nature given what so many are doing to ensnare their own profits. So basically we just are working. We're like a little hamster on the wheel, right? But more than 2 centuries after its creation, the poem continues to remind us that wonderful beauty in the natural world is its own justification. We don't have to justify it. One that money cannot buy. It's just what you actually gleaned, It's like, so what did you think of the poem? If you are more adventurous, you might look up information about the poet's life. So you could look up who is Wordsworth. Did he think about environmentalism back then? You would find out that Wordsworth worried he was losing his inspiration as he grew older. You would discover that the poem was written in 1804. The next stage of the critical process is then to look at the poet's craft. That is the handling of the language, the imagery, pictures you have seen in your mind. What makes the poetry different from prose is that poets are able to compress a great deal into a small amount of words. So getting and spending. In 3 words, he describes our whole economic system. That is compression of thought in a memorable sequence. Getting and spending. You get it, you spend it. One that has been used over and over, even by economists. Wordsworth makes us see an ocean in the image of the sea bearing its bosom to the moon. The sea, think large water without a shoreline, just water upon water. That would have served the purpose, but not equally well, right? The aptness of the phrasing in creating the image of the moon is similar to a great painting in words. How many times have you ever been down by Lake Michigan or wherever you are and looked at a large lake or a large ocean and seen the moon and it's shining down and all of the sparkling of the light of the moon, the reflection of the moon into the water? It's gorgeous. Finally, the poem is a sonnet, a demanding literary form in which the poet is restricted to 14 lines and writing in a definite rhythm. Often rhythm and rhyme are forced. If you read Wordsworth's poem aloud, which I probably didn't do the greatest job of, but if you read it aloud, try to find the rhythmic pattern. you will discover that unaccented syllables are followed by accented ones, that there are never two accented or unaccented syllables side by side. So, literalists and figuratists. So, non-critical thinkers might be called literalists, a term derived from their habitual way of not seeing general principles. They are tuned into what is happening in the moment, and their opinions are shaped by popular view and expressed by friends who are just like them, right? So they kind of like, doesn't matter if the Packers win or lose, and we're not going to figure out why, but they're our team. Done. So critical thinkers might be called figuratists, a term derived from the fact that their language is colorful and suggests wide experiences in many fields, including the humanities. If they are talking about the present moment, the likelihood is that they will see it in broader terms. So, are we looking at every play that was made and what the calls were and if so-and-so was injured and all of that? So now we're looking at, all of the bits. So most people fall into both categories. So literist speech, let's just see what that looks like. Literists are limited to what we may call the everyday concrete. They are also likely to listen haphazardly to what a figuratist is generally saying, latching on to the very last thing that they mentioned. So the figuratist would say, so many of the so-called professionals I run into don't seem to be what I would call experts. I'd love to meet one who could give me sound answers to important questions: where to live, whether to change jobs, what suntan lotion is most effective, where my child would get the best education. And the literalist would say, I didn't know you had children. And the figuratist would say, I don't. And then the literist would be blank stare. Now, if it were the figuratist speech, figuratists, especially those who are well-read, often use fancy metaphorical language. That is language that means something other than what is directly said. They are quick-witted and have effective ways of communicating. Figuratists are adept at twisting words, which in their original context were just mildly clever and making them shine with brilliance. So the figuratist says, I think my students don't know the difference between the classroom and their bedrooms because they're sleeping in class, right? But that's what they're... So the literalist says, my neighbor says her son likes to sleep in class. The figuratist, the least their parents could do is send them to school with pillows. The literalist, I don't think that would be wise. Okay, so there we have the figuratist is saying there is no certainty, not even when you're dealing with people who are expected to be experts. He or she is citing specific hypothetical examples to arrive at a general principle. So what are the learning objectives for this section of the course? I want you to be able to distinguish between Apollonian and Dionysian behavior and language. I want you to think about what the major steps are in solving a problem. And I want you to define the steps in personal critical responses and distinguish between what are literalists and what are figuratists. And that is the end of the lecture. So hope that helps you move along with your reading and your discussion questions. And I look forward to talking to you again next time.